Hello, hello, hello. Hope everyone is having a fantastic day. My name's Aditya Dewan, and welcome to the third episode of the Three Bucket Podcast, where we break down philosophy, emerging technologies, and self improvement content. Today, I have Carlos Sanchez online, and he's an expert in the field of nanotechnology and has done multiple really sick projects in the field as well. So, Carlos, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Didi. So, my name's Carlos. I am 16 years old. I'm currently working in the nanotechnology and nanomaterial field, specifically aerogel technologies, to look at how we can improve the material for climate change purposes and for future space exploration.
That's really cool. That's one thing I find with people from the Knowledge Society in particular is that all the projects that a lot of us have been doing are so sick. So, what are some of the projects that you've been doing?
Yeah, for sure. So at first I started in the space technology field because that was the first thing I got interested in. I still have my first telescope and I first have it in my room, but at least for me, I started off with looking at how we can leverage antimatter propulsion, specifically the production, because that's what we were lacking. Because to make it in a lab is very expensive. So I realized, is there a natural resource for antimatter? Now, the first thing that came into mind was, bananas, but they don't make enough. I realized, is there even more? Because then again, the language of the universe should have a natural resource for it. If it has a natural resource for everything, it should have a natural resource for antimatter. And I realized it came from humans, specifically beta plus decay. And an average 70, 80 kilogram-ish person is emitting around is 180 positrons or anti-electrons per hour. So although that may sound a lot, I realize that it's not really enough, to even warm up a cup of coffee. So I realized, which is kind of depressing, because if that number had been way higher, then basically humans are the answer then to antimatter. Then again, the next question would have been, how do we put them in a cell or something to extract it? But I don't think that'd be ethical. So that was the first main thing. But the way I got into nanotech specifically was when I realized that, okay, if we really wanted the antimatter in the first place, we need better materials. We need new substances, because if you think about it, everything in the world is materials. For example, the computer or the phone that I'm speaking with, or basically the chair that I'm sitting on, it's all made of materials, different structure. So I realized, okay, and with different properties. So that's when I realized, okay, if we can change the properties, then we may have something more that has more potential to be used in nanotech. So that's how I jumped into nanotechnology. But as you mentioned earlier, is nanotech is kind of scary because it's a little bit confusing when you go into the molecular level. So, having that said, I realized, let's bring nanotech to the rest of the world. Let's make it simple and easy. So for the past 5-6 months, I've been working on an open book. It's called 100 Nano Stories bookmark, and it basically brings down all the concepts of one nanomaterial that I got interested in, which was aerogel, and explain everything about aerogel and many sectors in nanotechnology, like organic chemistry, optics, and some mathematics, in a way that it's understandable from the novice to even the PhD student. And I think that's, at least for me, is publicly advocating for nanotech.
That sounds fantastic. I remember I was just checking out your LinkedIn a little bit before this. I think that there's actually a publication that used 100 stories of nanotech. And I've been reading through some of those articles as well, and it makes it very simple to understand. Nanotech is one of those things. I mean, this goes with all emerging technologies or skills, but it's one of those things where it has such a high cost to entry that you definitely need people like you who are breaking them down, who are allowing the general public to understand and hopefully catch on the bandwagon and do something cool with it.
Yeah, thank you. And that publication was actually under two things, where it was called Nano Summit 2021, where where I basically had to submit an abstract on 100 nanostories to get a speaker registration. And they enjoyed it because not only does it break down, I guess, like some concepts like Snell's law, where you can talk sort of like about the refraction index, or maybe even theoretical work on optics, like optical depth, which is basically one of those big concepts of talking about transparency in the silica area.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely very cool. Have you been doing any other projects besides that?
So at least for me is I've also been working on two other things. At least for me is preparing a research proposal. At least in a lab at my school, asking if I can use their lab and their equipment to look at a possible way of combining aerogel with climate change purposes. As I mentioned earlier, is can we make an aerogel that can capture carbon that has a large surface area to volume ratio? Because if we increase the surface area, we basically have a maximum absorption material, and if we decrease the volume, well, we depend less on thickness. That means it decreases the cost a little bit, and we can just increase as much of the size as we want it to. And if we can do that, basically we can turn into clothes, into products that can just basically suck CO2 out of the air without even like having to implement as much.
That literally sounds so cool. Like, I know I say that a lot, but that's literally because this is amazing, right? Like, if you think back to the Stone Age, like, first we started off with just our hands, no tools. Then we started using things like wood, like things that we could see, right? Then you start going underground. Oh, look, there are a lot of resources here as well. There's some tin, there's some gold, there's some copper. And then now we're at the point where we're going subatomic. Like, instead of going deeper underground, we're going deeper into our understanding of the very nature of reality and using it to make things. Like, one of the things that I found really interesting is the proposition of nanobots, right? Like, you have some sort of bot that's at the nanoscale, which is like 1,000th of an atom, I think.
One billionth of a meter. So that's basically like 10 to negative 9 meters. If for the audience out there, if you don't know how like small a nanometer is, if you were to take a marble, like if you were to get a marble and just put it on the ground, the whole Earth would be 1 meter, and then the marble would be 1 nanometer in scale. So,
oh my God.
Just to give you a perspective of how small a nanometer would be.
Yeah, that's literally so insane to think that now we have the technology to be engineering robots and things that are at that level of like smallness. My vocabulary died there, but it's interesting all the different implications that this technology has, right? Like, I know a lot of people are kind of scared that, oh, nanobots are gonna get into our body and tear us all apart. But what's also interesting is that it's being used in industries that are outside of healthcare and even like energy, like as you mentioned, aerogels for climate change. Like, if you can engineer the very properties of a material from the ground up, then that gives you basically the power over creation. You can literally create anything at that scale, anything that you want to at all. You can re-engineer gold to have like a different color if that's something that you're into.
Yes, and yes, that is so true, because then again, like even like our oldest ancestors, they realized, okay, let's say we want to draw a story, or like those paintings on the walls that you may see in like ancient photos, probably in like history textbooks.
Yeah.
Where yes, they had to use certain materials to draw it, but also you're also right, as we go smaller and smaller into basically the atomic scale and the molecular scale of, okay, let's engineer things at this size, which also to me is also fascinating, because then again, it's really on like where's our limit. But I don't think the atomic scale is our limit. I feel like we're going to now play the game against physics, where basically like the Alcubierre warp drive, for those space tech enthusiasts, it's basically basically you could sort of go faster than the speed of light without actually, breaking the laws of physics. So I kind of feel like that might be like, surpassing the limit. That's why I believe that, this is like next level breaking barriers. But I feel like the Alchemy or warp drive is going to be like that's basically God's best creation, at least for me, since space tech is biased.
Yeah. Like warp drives? So,
Yes, warp drive.
yeah. What are some other areas that you think nanotech is going to be into, like predominantly in the next decades? If you were to predict, like, which one do you think nanotech would have the most impact in? I mean, it's obviously going to impact all of them in some shape, way, or form, but like, which one do you think would, I guess, benefit the most from nanotechnology?
Okay. So, at least for me, is when I look at it in every sector, from like nanomedicine, nanomaterials, just like nanobots in general. Obviously, there are two places where I can see it. The first one is obviously anything that has to do with biology or medicine. It's already starting to. They're beginning to implement this in like nanoparticles, which is one huge field where, yes, basically just what's it called, change the properties. You can basically make sure it doesn't interact with any other organism in the body. So I feel like in the next 10 years we could use this as to cure diseases, or to even tackle it against cancer cells, which has already been done so far. So I could really see a huge advancement in nanotech with anything medical. But also, in terms of basically real-world engineering applications, nanomaterials is going to sort of become its own field, I believe. It's kind of already its own field, but I feel like it's going to go to a whole nother level. Because, as I mentioned, everything in this world is made out of materials. All you got to do is you can change the chemistry around, and boom, you have new properties. So at least for me, nanomaterials is going to be the second biggest field impacted by nanotechnology. So that's how I would see the way that nanotechnology can impact anyone in the next 10 years.
That's a very good way of putting it. And actually, I think that's also almost a testament to the healthcare industry as an entirety, right? That so many
Yes.
like healthcare startups have been coming up in the last couple of weeks, months, and even I feel like in the last 2 years, like there's almost been an infatuation with the healthcare industry from even big tech companies, right? Like I think Google and Apple, and maybe even Amazon to some extent, fact check me on this, but tried to go inside the healthcare industry, and they tried to do basic things, like how can doctors access the records of multiple people at the same time? How can doctors like better treat patients? How can we cure antibiotic resistance? And what's interesting is that people are kind of throwing technologies at the healthcare problem. Like, oh, an AI can diagnose cancer. And, there's things like, and now there's nanotech as well. And there's so many ways that we can impact the healthcare industry, which is interesting because if in the next 5 years, right, all of these technologies are currently in development, and most experts assume that we'll reach like a saturation point with these technologies in the next 5 to 10 years. And when that happens, when all of these technologies, you have quantum computing, AI, additive manufacturing, and innovations in the energy industry even, when all of these come together, then what happens? Like what's the next step? Because if you have so many different solutions, all of them work amazingly, then the end impact on the healthcare industry, and not just the healthcare industry, the entire world, would be profound.
Yes. And that's also the one thing, is when you start implementing technologies in like any field, even though yes, you do need technologies in any field, from like the calculator you use on a math quiz to basically, let's say, AI in healthcare. I think for me is when there are so many solutions, just to implement them on one single field. Honestly, I would have to go back and remember that it's not just the technology, but it's also like who is like the target of these technology, and that's the person. So that's when I would that's when I would consider looking ethically, and like those philosophical brain dumps. Something, okay, which technologies we know that are actually going to be beneficial and are going to be accepted the most by other people.
Yeah.
Versus something that may not seem that may not have the validations or just the acceptance of many other people. Like, for example, the biggest example is like, oh yeah, AI is going to kill us all someday. So, I mean, yeah, that kind of makes sense, but at the same time, AI is nowhere near that. I'm not trying to bash AI or anything, but that's not going to happen very soon. It's just you need the rest of the world to understand how the technology works. I think that's where we're lacking, because you can't implement anything if people don't know how it works. Because I feel like that's the biggest hindrance to implementing any technology.
Absolutely. Like, public opinion plays such a huge role in not only technologies, like in any sort of policy that's been implemented in the ever since there's been a government, basically. And it's interesting how misinformation about these technologies spreads so quickly, and there is almost a massive, not necessarily public divide, but I feel like people sometimes take half the facts and they attempt to draw out conclusions based on those facts, right? Like, and what's interesting is that both sides are right. Like, there's no right or wrong, right? Like, let's say I have a bunch of like 3 or 4 data points, right? And based on those data points, I draw a line. That line is now my conclusion. And I'm like, okay, this is the conclusion I have. And when I'm explaining it to someone else, instead of giving them all 4 of those data points, I only give them 2. So they just have 2 points and they end up drawing a line instead of like maybe a curve or something, right? So they have a completely different conclusion, but it's not necessarily because it was right or wrong. It's because one person has more data points, right? One person has a different amount of data points than the other person. And because of this, they come to different conclusions than other people. And what's interesting is the fact that a lot of people today are kind of bashing these technologies. Like, not necessarily bashing, right? Like, there's a massive opposition, I would say, to automation because, a lot of people are scared that, oh, it's going to take everyone's jobs, whatever. I was talking about this with Shree's podcast last time. But what's interesting is that the people who are actively working on these technologies have those data points that the general public just doesn't have. Yet the people in government usually aren't the people who are handheld and manufacturing these technologies. The people who are at the front lines of development. So would you say that maybe, I guess, experts in this field would have more of a say than the general public? Do you feel like it's a debate even worth having?
Okay, that is a very good question. So, because remember, you have to worry about the 2 things, like the people who have the facts, the people who know how the process works, versus the people you are targeting or affecting, which is basically the public. So with theory, yes, you have to see both sides. You want to be impartial. However, it is both like, for me, it's kind of like a duty for the people who know how the process works to actually explain, okay, how does it work? Because if you don't, you're basically, just you're just going to leave, it's misinformation, and it just causes a lot of like dilemma, chaos that you don't need to have in the first place. But also with the general public, you have to be willing to actually, listen to them, because at some way you have to tell them, hey, yeah, you don't know everything, you don't know how it really works, so let us explain it. But if you're going to be ignorant, not let them explain or understand how it works, then that's where conflicts begin. But at the same time, if the general public has a question that that the researchers or the government, whatever, can answer, I guess it should be answered. But if there's a reason why they can't, they should explain at least why they don't. They shouldn't just say, "Oh, we can't answer it because we can't."
Yeah.
Because then again, that kind of just puts like that speculation of, oh, they're hiding something, which you don't want because then that just like loses all that trust and self-respect, especially if it's like a company or a person.
Yeah. And I feel like just going off of what you were saying there, is that one of the reasons that people seek out more information is a sense of humility, right? Like, in order for me to actively listen, like 100% I agree with you. Experts definitely need to be communicating their research more openly, like, and not necessarily in the form of scientific papers, right? Like, I've tried reading some papers, and definitely it's valuable, 100%. But I feel like when you make papers overly formal and overly complex than they need to be, then you're actually restricting the message. You're basically diluting what it is you're trying to say behind a vast array of complex vocabulary, right? Like, I've seen a lot of papers where what they're trying to say is, okay, we've made an AI that can detect fractures in people. But they will take perhaps the most complicated way to say that sentence and say it in a way that an average person who's just really interested into science, maybe, who's reading the paper, has no clue what they're talking about. And then that kind of thing breeds disdain, right? Then people are like, okay, if I try to seek out more knowledge, I know for a fact that, like, it's not openly accessible. Either that, or maybe they might say, oh, I'm just too stupid to understand. But you know what, as a couple, I don't know who this quote's from, but there aren't any bad students, only bad teachers.
That is correct, and this is a little bit of a tangent I might go on, but I guess this is essential, I guess, for like maybe at least anyone in the audience to hear is that you are absolutely correct when you say that yes, there are only bad teachers. The reason why is because there are two things. Yeah, you can't explain it simple enough, or you just don't know how to actually access it to the public. And that's one of the main reasons why I did 100 Nano Stories, was explain nanotechnology for the public. Because, yes, there are plenty of scientists, but there are more people, regular people, than there are scientists. Yeah. So, that's what I also think is you have to think futuristically or think ahead when you're making content or when you're trying to develop something. You have to think of, okay, who are you targeting? Are you targeting an actual scientist that you want for them to read your paper? Then yes, go technical. But sometimes the majority is you're building this content to build your name or to build a portfolio or to sort of say, this is who I am. So with that, you have to focus on the public, and the majority of the public may not even know what like refraction is. So you're not going to give the technical what's it called, sentence or explanation of it. You want to give it in a way where you can give examples. So at least for there is, yes, explain it simple. And that's also another thing with research papers that I'm kind of like okay with is read the introduction and the conclusion. For like anyone who's reading research papers, do that first. And then you'll get an idea of if that research paper is good for you or not. So yeah. But that's also something that I would highly advocate is anyone who's doing something big or a project, try and do that. Like explain it to the public via don't do it via 100 articles because that one's a little bit stressy. but yes, you should be able to explain anything that you're working on and explain it simply. Think futuristically is something I would say.
Yeah. TLDR, know your audience when explaining something.
Yes.
You don't want to go into a room of investors, give them a highly technical pitch that no one understands, and then end up coming out and wondering, "Oh my god, my idea was so good. Why didn't they invest?" And then it's just like the art of being able to communicate your idea simply is so important. Like it's almost more important than the idea itself. Like, I mean, obviously it isn't more important, but it's pretty up there. Like if I have the cure for cancer, yet I can't pitch it to investors because the way I'm explaining it is so complicated and no one invests in it. Well, even if it can cure cancer, you don't have any money. You can't build out the product. And I mean, okay, this is kind of an extreme example, but if you were to do something like that and you were to come up with such a cool invention, yet you completely fail at mastering the art that is communication, you have basically, like, not necessarily, your business has basically died by suicide in that context.
Yeah, that's sort of like an extreme way of saying it, but yes, because your product is worthless if you don't know how to execute it. So that's something that that every person, like whether you have a good product or just like something cool to share, you got to know how to master the art of sharing. And that's a great point, Didier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This reminds me of something that Peter Thiel said once. For those of you who don't know, he's insanely legit. He worked with PayPal, with Elon Musk, part of the PayPal mafia. If you guys don't know what that is, search it up. It's like a ring of people, like in the executive side of things with regards to PayPal, and all of them ended up being successful. Like Elon Musk is a part of that. The co-founders of YouTube, I think, were part of that as well. So what I was trying to say is that it's interesting because the people who are probably going to read papers first need to make a subconscious decision that they want to learn, right? Like it's like you can be forgiven if you ask for mistakes. Sorry, what am I saying? You can be forgiven if you admit a mistake, but the act of admitting a mistake itself is the confession, right? Like you have to have the willingness to confess first. And similarly is that I feel like in this day and age in particular, a lot of people kind of not necessarily are ignorant that, oh, we know everything, but they kind of don't care, right? And this goes back to what I was saying about Peter Thiel, is that he believes that there are four kinds of economic, not necessarily economic types, but different types of values within countries, right? There is indefinite optimism. And what that means basically is that you think that from now the future will be better. 110%. Indefinite optimism. You don't have to do anything. The future will 100% be better. Then on the opposite side of that, there's indefinite pessimism. And I think Thiel mentioned in his book 0 to 1 that that's like characteristic of Europe today. Not sure how true that is, but the point is that you believe that the future will be worse in the future than it is now, and it's going to happen without you doing anything. Regardless of what you do, the future will probably be worse. And that's the philosophy that garners most of Europe. I think he was mentioning a study about housing prices, how most people live in the present as opposed to in the future there. Then you have places like, for example, China, which are more definite pessimism. And definite pessimism is that we know that the future will be bad. Let's do something about it, right? So you can see this, that China's, like in the last 20 years, they've done an insane amount of work, both economically and politically, and most of it is based off of modern cities, right? Like New York, for example, Shanghai is like buildings, skyscrapers, that kind of thing. And the last type is definite optimism. And this is arguably the most important one, but it's also the one that's most often missing. And definite optimism is we know the future will be better, but the problem is that we know that we need to work for it. That the future doesn't become better without us first working for it, right? In contrast to indefinite optimism, which we know the future will be better, but we don't know how it's going to be better. And if people don't know how it's going to be better, then you don't know what to work towards. And if you don't work towards it, then the future doesn't become better, and it's a vicious cycle. So I feel like because of that indefinite optimism culture, that's led to this sort of notion that not necessarily we don't know everything, that we know everything, but the notion that why do I care, you know? That there's no reason that the scientists can take care of it. I don't need to concern myself.
Mm-hmm. But also at the same time, you can also be a scientist, and you can also be a scientist just like right now, because in some way, the way I like to define a scientist is not the person who, just reads research papers as his job. It's basically Googling up anything, and just for like your own curiosity, because at the same time, if you think about it to a certain extent, that's what scientists have to do, is they have to research things or just experiment and find, okay, what did I come out with this? It's the same thing when you like Google, okay, like who won, like who's in the Champions League final, which is what I did this morning. So, and at least for me, that's like I found my answer. So basically, I found out that okay, it's Man City versus Chelsea for the final. So at the same time, you did your own discovery and you found out, okay, this is the definite answer. So at the same time, it's not that you don't care. It's just that in those specific sections, you just haven't found what drives you, what grabs your curiosity. But I guess like in that question where you say the future will be better, I guess we could say in what aspect? Because if you say the future will be better in terms of what? If you say in terms of, let's say, better climate, okay, then that narrows it down. But when you say better, the future will be better, well, you could say it could be better in sports. It may definitely will. So it just really depends on what aspect someone is talking about. Yeah. Because yes, there can both be the good and the bad. It just depends on what context specifically.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the problem with indefinite optimism. Is that the context isn't with definite optimism? There is a context, right? Like we think the future will be better in this way. This is how we're going to make it work. Indefinite optimism is what you were saying, where it's like, okay, but in what context, right? So that's definitely one of the main thing. Like that's the main logical reasoning behind this kind of proof. And honestly, like based off what you just said, like a scientist doesn't necessarily need to be someone at a university in a lab coat, as you were saying, right? Like it's about feeding your curiosity. And what's interesting is that the more you feed your curiosity, the more it grows. Like if you're, for example, at the tip of an iceberg, the more you discover the rest of the iceberg, the more you find that, okay, this iceberg is bigger than I thought. You find more to discover. And it's the same thing. Like imagine going down a YouTube rabbit hole, except instead of watching like random videos, you're like, okay, I want to find out how self-driving cars work. Within 2 hours of diving deep into like just autonomous vehicles just from Google, you could probably have a good discussion with someone, I don't know, like maybe on a video call, maybe like not necessarily an expert, but you would know significantly more about the field than the average person.
Yes, and also that reminds me of when you tie back to the iceberg is also, let's say when you mentioned how, if we go down and we find out how big the iceberg is under the water, there's just one thing, is the iceberg that you can see right now that's above the surface of the water, you have to know, okay, how do I climb down just to even see what's below it? So for me is, you got to master, at least for me, is you got to master how to get down there in order to get to what's actually, what you can't notice. It's the same thing when you learn a new concept is if you want to dive deep more, you got to master the fundamentals. It's the same thing as if you were to climb down the iceberg you got to know how to actually, where to put your foot so you can and get down so you can actually, swim down and find the more in depth of the iceberg. It's the same thing with like learning something. That's something that just came out from that.
Yeah. And actually, this is another thing that I just thought of based on the iceberg analogy, is that everyone's usually scared of like some sort of failure, right? Oh, I'm scared this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But the thing is that if you are trying to climb down the top of the iceberg and you fall, right? The thing is that if you fall into the water, which is what's probably going to happen if the iceberg's like relatively small, okay, that was a little too specific, but the point is that if you fall off the iceberg and you fall underwater, sure you might fall, but then you've just discovered the rest of the iceberg. You've discovered the part that was underwater. And I think that's like almost a symbolic way of saying that when you fall down trying to achieve something, that teaches you more about both that thing and yourself than what you'd have known before. It uncovers more of the iceberg. And you did it by falling. Like, so in a way, it was like a direct way of discovering the rest of the iceberg instead of taking it step by step.
Yeah, that also kind of, that kind of just reminds me of like, seek discomfort and such. Like, yes, there are certain things like, you're going to sort of struggle with. That, like, for example, like maybe, climbing down an iceberg just to see, okay, what's underwater. Well, there are two ways you can do it. You can purposely throw yourself off, or you accidentally fall off. Yeah. But then again, which one hurts? Then again, most people could say like which one hurts more, like accidentally slipping and then hitting the ice and then falling to the water, or actually positioning yourself to actually fall into the water. So for there, I'd say purposely seek discomfort, because there you're actually in control of, okay, I'm going to fall into the water like this instead of, I'm going to hit myself many times before I land in the water. Yeah. So that, I would say, actually have a plan when you're going to seek discomfort rather than just slip. and then hit the ice and then go down.
Yeah. And I think that's a very profound message right there. The fact that if you actively seek anything, the very choice that you're making of actively doing it makes it much better, right? Like an example of this, for example, okay, ignoring that. For example, like if you get something to do, right? Let's say someone tells you to do something like, okay, go, I don't know, write 1,000-word essay, right? Like, sure, you might really like writing essays and that might work for you, right? But I know for me and a lot of other people personally, if you were the one who chose to write the essay yourself, you would do a lot better at it. And not because, like, it's not because of the fact that, oh, I can just make it bad because there's no one watching over me. It's because you realize that when you ask yourself those three questions, which is like the question that why am I here, right? Like, why am I doing this? The answer isn't, oh, someone else told me to. This sucks. Someone else told me to do it. That's why I have to do it. It's no, I told myself to do this. I was the one who chose to, as you were saying, jump off the iceberg. So now it becomes my responsibility to climb back up. It becomes my responsibility to finish it, make it high standards. And it becomes, I take ownership of the problem because I've just admitted that it was my fault. Like extreme ownership, basically. Taking ownership of all of your life's problems, even if it's not your fault, it's now your responsibility to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. That good analogy, good example with using the analogy is also like, I guess like specifically to like TKS or just like anyone. It's like same thing with like content creation is okay. If you want to make like let's say a series on where you explain like a certain section in like maybe let's say a quantum tunneling or something, where if you're doing it because you want to do it. It's not because you want to make progress or something like that. No, you actually care about it, and the second thing is you have an audience. Like you know who you want to target with whatever you like to do. Specifically for the essay, the audience right here may be like your future self, where okay, my future self will be happy because look, I did it. Or it could be someone, or it could be a larger audience. Like let's say, let's give it like 2,000 people, or like a large conference where you were chosen to speak at. There, it's more okay. How do I execute my plan so that it fits the audience? So those are the two components, I would look at, especially when you said it's doing something you want to do.
Yeah. And just like branching off from that topic, like doing what you want to do. And I feel like there are so many people out there who have tried doing something new, right? And because of the fact that they think that, okay, like everyone has a version of themselves that they believe. Like I might believe that, oh, I'm an amazing writer, I'm good at running or something like that, right? And everyone has that sort of vision. And what's interesting is that I think James Clear mentions this in Atomic Habits, that people will do anything they can to meet that version of themselves. And let's say that you want to become someone who's good at science, right? Maybe you want to do something like that. But in your mind, there's this concept that, oh, I'm not smart. You'll subconsciously try to live that out. Even if you're perfectly capable, you'll stop yourself from ever diving into the thing in the first place. Like, if you jump off the iceberg and it turns out there's nothing underneath, like, then that just might prevent you from ever jumping off icebergs, which would be kind of stupid, right? Like, if for example, you're a miner and you're trying to find gold, if you don't find gold in one spot, the miner doesn't just quit. You obviously would try to find gold in other spots. You would evaluate, okay, what did I mess up on? What did I go back on?
By the way, James Clear is a legend. So just for like anyone, he'll make you fall in love with like the wisdom quotes. Just like gives you something to look at and sort of reevaluate yourself. But yes, and I also do have sometimes those questions in like with material science and such as like, okay, I want to be one of those like one of those iconic material scientists or someone who can basically answer some of those questions. And yes, sometimes I try and seek that image of myself, but at the same time, it's not good. Like, it's not healthy for you at some points, because
Yeah.
there was like a period a couple of months ago where I tried to do that, but I realized that it's not going to go well, because you're not supposed to know everything.
Yeah.
No one knows everything, so you should. That's one thing of the illusion of letting go, is you will always constantly, having to improve yourself. So
Yeah.
that's just one thing of advice I can give you from that.
Yeah. And I know, like, at least for me, like, before, just a couple of months ago, right? Like, I was at a relatively low point with regards to, not really productivity, but just regards to overall satisfaction, right? And I remember listening to podcasts like these and thinking, oh my God, these guys, like, sure, it's easy to say it, right? But it's another thing entirely to actually have to break past that border. And what's interesting is that when you're at that low point, it pushes you out of the race. Like, it forces you to get your head outside of the rat race and really look like, okay, where am I going? Right? Like, those moments where you realize that, okay, I've been executing for so long, but do I know where I'm headed? Do I know if the forest I'm in is even the right one? Or am I just too obsessed with the trees?
So yes. Also, that's kind of a funny story, because that's again, like, when, like, at least for me specifically, like with the nano stories, when I want the nano stories was to target nanotechnology to the public, and when there I also have to realize, okay, I know I want to go to the public, but then again, am I being too specific? But also at the same time, where am I headed? Because remember, if you think about it, 100 sounds easy, but you also have to realize, okay, what areas of the race are you going towards? Because, like, for example, if, let's say in this race there's like an acid pit and you have to go through it, well, of course you're not going to go through an acid pit. So you may have to, find a different way. Find a way that you can actually go through and complete the race. So also at the same time, it's like, look around, like, and actually know the race, or like know where you're going before you even get there.
Yeah.
Which is pretty much like, always have a plan. Think futuristically is what is the words I was looking for.
Yeah. Think futuristically, but live in the present.
Yes.
And that.
Yeah, you gotta.
Yeah.
That's one thing, is live in the present, but have an idea of the future. But don't indulge. Don't invest your time in the future, because the future's not here yet. So you don't have to worry about it. Worry about it once it gets here. I think that's one thing.
Yeah. Or even better, if you're worrying about the future, then that's one thing that I've noticed, is that life will give you these signals, right? Mm-hmm. If you're feeling a certain way, then people don't just have emotions for no reasons, right? Like, there is some stimulus that happens, and then your brain sends off a bunch of chemicals, and then that's what makes you feel that way. So you have to, like, retrace. Like, if you're feeling scared about the future, it's like, okay, why am I feeling scared? And it might be, oh, because I have a test tomorrow. Then ask yourself further, okay, why am I scared that I have a test tomorrow? And it's like, well, because tests make me nervous. But, okay, and then let's go layer deeper. Why do tests make you nervous? And it might be like, oh, previously I've failed tests. I don't want my grade to be lower. Okay, why don't you want your grade to be lower? And then you go down this chain, and then you might eventually find that your fear of a test was really just your fear of having no control over your life. Maybe that was one thing. And then once you found, like, that root cause, then you can attack it. Then you've given your enemy a face, right? Then you know what to attack. And what's interesting is that if you're making this decision a week before that event actually happens, you now actively have the power to change the outcome of that event, right? Like, if I'm scared, I'm going to fail. But it's good that I realize this right now rather than during the test, because now I have the power to prepare. I have the power to do things that will make me more likely to achieve higher on the test, whether that's deepening my understanding, doing more practice problems, whatever. And that's what's interesting, is that people will always say, like, my life is ruined, etc. But your life is still in the future. You can change it. There's still so much time. If you just change what you're doing right now, and you do something else, the rest of that outcome will change as well.
absolutely true. And this, yeah, that's something interesting because like that just sounds like let's go like Elon Musk's first principle is like, okay, what's the cost? What's the cost of, let's say, aluminum? Why is it so high? Okay, what is a better material that has the same properties and such? That's also it's kind of the same thing with like material science. Is also, having to see what's like what's good to produce in produce in large quantities, like forward vertical integration and such. And like notice, okay, what can we do in these cases? And yeah, first principles is such a great way of looking at things. For if anyone who hasn't used it, definitely recommend.
Yeah. Actually, I just had a thought. Nanotech is really just construction except from first principles.
Yeah. There's two ways. The top down approach, but the one you're thinking of is also bottom up approach. The top down is basically getting something large, and just breaking it down into like smaller pieces and finding its fundamentals. But then there's the bottom up one, which is like you start from the nanoscale and then build your way up. But yeah, those are the two ways of how you can build anything from nanotech. But yeah, it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny now that you mentioned it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's actually a very interesting thing. Like, going back to the nanotech side of things, is that really all of these emerging technologies are either abstractions or I don't know what the opposite of abstraction is, but like think about AI. AI is really just taking our mind and trying to replicate it, right? We're trying to abstract a complex thing and make it less complex. Nanotech is about taking the building blocks of life, looking at the smaller ones, the ones that make up even those building blocks, and engineering those, right? 3D printing, engineering things from the ground up without actually having to put them together, right? And blockchain as well, right? It's all about deconstructing current myths, not even myths, like breaking assumptions. This is how the world's always worked, but looking past that assumption and then asking yourself, is there a better way? And then that's like kind of how these fields were born, at least from my understanding of their history.
Yes, and that's also one thing is I've noticed that the majority of times it's more or less as we take something large and we break it down.
Yeah.
But I think where most things stop is, okay, how do we take something that we just broke down and change it into something new?
Yeah.
We're basically from the ground up. I think that's the majority of society. It's like I don't know why, but we like breaking things, but
yeah.
But it's hard to create new things. Like even if it's just like a simple question on a quiz, like, all right, give me something new. You're like, okay, what do I say? Yeah. But if someone said, okay, give me an example of something that would break. Well, you might have an immediate answer for that.
Yeah. And actually, I think that's very like not indicative. It's very common with something that Steve Jobs said, right? Like this applies to startups as well. Like it's so hard to come up with a startup idea, and what Steve Jobs was giving advice or in an interview or something. And he was saying that the best startup ideas or ideas in general, creativity, doesn't come from like a magical source, right? It comes from, I think another person said this, that the greatest artists steal. That it comes from having different experiences that are different from other people, unique experiences, and then stealing a little bit from each one of that unique experience to make something new. And to you, it doesn't seem new, right? Because it's just like you've already had those experiences. So, like, for example, let's say I've gone kayaking, right? Not many people have gone kayaking. And let's say I'm also very good at, woodworking, right? Not many people are good at woodworking. But the intersection between the people who've gone kayaking and done woodworking is really small. So maybe you say, oh, I have a design for a new type of kayak that's 100% fat. This is obviously completely insane, but the point is that because of those unique experiences, you were able to come up with something new. And to you, that idea might not even seem new. Like, oh, a wooden kayak, whatever, I thought about that 100 times. But to other people who haven't had those experiences, that might be like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly, because what you just said is you're breaking down two things and creating one.
Yeah.
Which at the same time, like, yeah, anyone can do with like experiences, like you mentioned with the wind kayak, but it's also just, having that ability to, break something down, but also having that ability to, okay, I have everything at its fundamentals. What can I do with these fundamentals to create, something like something like macros in the macro scale,
Yeah.
rather than in like the molecular or the atomic scale.
Yeah. Would you have any tips for like people who want to gain more unique experiences? Like not even unique experiences, like just trying to expose yourself to as much. How do you seek discomfort?
All right, so at least for me, in terms of writing, since I guess that's something that I've been working on, and one thing that has repeatedly come out of every single thing I've done is with content creation, focus on three things. Is the first one is obviously what is your content about, because most of the time, like I'm pretty consistent with writing in the nano stories, but then again, it's very rare. It's very rare, at least, to be consistent and have actually good content to come out. Because sometimes when you do, you're basically giving information that isn't as exciting. Basically, what I mean is the majority of people who write consistently don't really have anything to say. They're just posting because they have to. So with that, I need to have a plan. Every time I write, it has to be something related to what I'm working on. So the first thing I would say is make sure what you're writing is related to what you're doing. If it's just to make up the numbers, then that's not a good use of your time. The second thing is know your audience. If it's something scientific, do it. If it's something like more for the public to know, okay, make sure the article sounds like something anyone can understand. The third one, which is kind of where I struggled at bit, was article length.
Yeah.
Where basically some people may not even have that much to talk about, so that it'll be like a 2-minute or maybe just like a 3-minute. That sounds more like a tweet, in my opinion. So I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, but if it can fit in like a Twitter thread, then that probably shouldn't be an article.
Yeah.
But if it's like 20 minutes long, who cares if it's for the public? No one's gonna read 20 minutes. It's like just looking at it and saying 20-minute read is exhausting already. I don't know it's like reading a research paper, except like with extra steps in some way. Yeah. I don't know if that's how you feel. Like every time you hear 20 minutes to read or 20-minute watch, you're just like, oh no. Is that you?
No, but I'm definitely guilty of writing 20-minute long articles. Like, yeah. But whenever I do, I think this also comes into play with what you mentioned, like the first two principles, is that if you know your audience well enough, then if your article's 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes are filled with value, and each one of those minutes forces the audience to want to go to the next one, then it works out. But the key is to make sure that your length is justified. And I think this goes for anything, right? Like even I guess like books and stuff. Whatever you're doing, make sure the length is justified. If you're a part of a club, make sure the amount of time you're putting into it is justified with like your values or something. The amount of time you put into an article. The length that you might like, but you get what I'm saying, right? Like,
yes, that makes sense, because remember, you have to know your audience in order to do the length. So, at least for me, since for me, I do 3 to 7 minute articles, because I realize 3 minutes is good enough so that it isn't a tweet. But 7 minutes is basically where I realize, okay, that's where like any public audience, whether it be the novice or the person who works in academia, will have enough time to read it and actually gain the valuable information. But it also tests your ability to, can you explain things simply? Yeah. That's why I also like 3 to 7 minutes long. Is, do I know it well enough so that I can explain it in simple terms, on basically like the online platform. Yeah. So I think that's just my tips in writing. But in terms of tips of like seeking discomfort, at least for me, is don't seek discomfort blindly, because you can get hurt. Just like the iceberg iceberg scenario.
Yeah.
Don't try and do it accidentally, or don't close your eyes. Because if you're not even looking where you're going, you have no plan, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Or you may put yourself in a worse situation than what you were if you didn't seek discomfort.
Yeah.
So, in that way, I would say get as much knowledge, like build intuition of whatever discomfort you're going to take. Like, for example, let's say if you want to go, let's say swim in like the ocean for like an hour. I guess with that you would have to say, okay, to build intuition, how should I swim in the ocean, or what animals are going to be in the ocean that could be dangerous, rather than just like going head on into the sea and then make sure you get the hour. No, you might die, so you might as well. So I'd say know what you're going to do, build the intuition to do it.
Yeah. And actually, you know what? I think that's a perfect place to end off. Do what you're going to do, but understand the intuition behind doing it, and make sure that you have the intuition behind doing this. Yeah. Thanks so much for doing this, Carlos. This was amazing, and your insight on nanotech is fantastic.
All right, thank you, Didier.
Yeah.
Good luck, audience.
Yeah, the pleasure was all mine. See you.
See you.